Welcome, everybody. I am Sophie Smith, the Assistant Director of the York Public Library, and I am so pleased to welcome you to our program tonight about the power of salt marshes in a changing climate. This talk is part of the climate series that York Public Library and the York Climate Action Plan Steering Committee have put together to explore different facets of the climate conversation in the months leading up to the town's spring referendum on which the York Climate Action Plan seeks to be approved by voters. We've heard about local fisheries, Maine's statewide climate actions, and later in the month, we'll hear about climate change on two very different topics, tick-borne diseases and mental health. You can find out more about this whole series at yorkpubliclibrary.org/climate, where we'll have recordings of previous events and listings of those to come. We are recording tonight's event, and it will be available on our website in the next couple of days. By default, I have everybody muted to begin, but when our speakers are ready for questions, please feel free to unmute and ask away. You're welcome to use the chat feature as well. Without further ado, let's get started. So we're joined tonight in our program, which is co-sponsored by York Land Trust, a nonprofit organization led by a dedicated group of community members working to conserve and protect York's natural resources and cultural heritage. I'm going to turn it over to Laura Popick, Outreach and Programming Coordinator, to get us started. Laura, take it away.
All right, thanks so much, Sophie. Yeah, we're really excited to be co-hosting this event, and we're really excited that you've all chosen to spend this evening with us. So thanks for joining us. Yeah, we're going to spend the next hour exploring salt marshes. It's a topic that is so pertinent to the town of York, given just how many amazing salt marshes we have in town and all of the great natural benefits they serve, both for plants and animals, and also for us and for the climate and the environment in general. So we're going to be exploring these environments first with a guest speaker we have with us, Kristen Perrier from the Maine Natural Areas Program, who's been studying these environments for many years, both in York and elsewhere across the state. So Kristen's going to start us off with kind of a deep dive into what salt marshes are, some of the things that are threatening salt marshes in a changing climate, and also some of the ways that salt marshes can help us through some of the effects of the climate change that we're experiencing. And once she has gone through her presentation, I'll kind of bring the conversation back to some of the specific ways that the Land Trust has been working to protect these environments in town, and then we'll open up to questions. That said, I think, if you have any burning questions along the way, feel free to pop them in the chat, and we'll take a look at those throughout as well. We want this to be interactive and engaging for all of you. So with that, yeah, I'll hand it over to Kristen.
Okay, thank you, Laura, and thank you, Sophie. I love that you introduced this as the power of salt marshes. That just feels very energizing and great. And I would agree that they have a lot of superpowers for human communities and biodiversity, and hopefully we can support those well into the future. I'm also recognizing that the scene behind me is not a salt marsh, so I apologize for getting off script here. It's a reminder for me to tell you all that I do work statewide, and but I've been spending years in the marshes, and probably spend about 30% of my time working on salt marshes and coastal issues for the state. So I'm going to get my screen up here. And Laura, can you just tell me if I've got the slideshow going, and give me a thumbs up if it starts? Okay, great. And I'm not going to be able to see the chat because I only have one screen. So feel free to interrupt me if there's any burning questions, Laura or Sophie. Otherwise, maybe we'll
will do.
At the end. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, I think we're good to go. Okay, so I will jump right into a quick outline here. So I'll to start off, I'm going to spend, as Laura mentioned, some time talking about the ecology of salt marshes and try to convey how many important roles they play for biodiversity, climate resiliency, and
your audio is very difficult. Could you please speak into your microphone?
Sure. Let me move it in here. This is why I've got the earphones on, so I don't have to yell and make my whole family listen. Is this better?
It's a little bit spotty, kind of like in and out.
Okay. right, I'm going to take it off actually and see if this is any better. All right, can you hear me better now?
That does sound better.
Okay. So much for the headphones. They look goofy anyway. Okay, thank you for that. So we'll talk about tidal marsh ecology and functions, and then I'll move into talking about sea level rise and show you how sea level rise has been mapped in Maine, and then what we can predict about the future of tidal marshes, and end with hopefully a positive note on what can and is being done to protect them. So a quick introduction on Maine Natural Areas Program. I'm an ecologist with the program, and for those of you that are not familiar with the program, we're part of the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. We're a small group of about 7 right now, so but we do work statewide, and we're part of a network that of what are called natural heritage programs that exist in every state in the U.S. and in Atlantic Canada. Our core program mission is the documentation of rare plants and rare or exemplary natural communities and ecosystems statewide. And then we track the status and condition of those features, and then share that information with landowners to inform land management, but also with towns, the Beginning with Habitat program, which some of you may be familiar with. Also, of course, with land trusts, planning agencies, and others to equip decision makers with comprehensive information for their land use planning. MNAP also manages the monitoring within the state's ecological reserve system. That is the long-term monitoring of forest and inland wetland sites. And then last year we partnered with the Maine Coastal Program to install the first year of vegetation monitoring points within salt marshes, part of a long-term monitoring network called the Sentinel Site Network, to look at the impacts of sea level rise on tidal marshes. So getting right to the marshes now. In total, our program has mapped about 22,000 acres of tidal marshes throughout the state. We've done this through remote work and also through field-based data collection, so boots on the ground. And this area, for your fun fact of the day, is second only to Massachusetts in terms of the acres of tidal marsh in any New England state. So Maine certainly plays a role in the condition and persistence of this group of tidal wetlands into the future. In Maine, in our program, we recognize 4 different natural community types that are tidal. These range from the salty lower estuary type, such as this Spartina salt marsh pictured on the top left here, to brackish and to freshwater tidal. Most of that freshwater tidal marsh is in Mary Meeting Bay, the bigger expanses of it. That's about 4,000 acres, and it makes up just about 20% of our total tidal marsh area. So that leaves about 80% of the tidal marshes that are actually that lower estuary Spartina salt marsh type that most of you are probably the most familiar with. What's interesting is the majority of our salt marshes are located south of Penobscot Bay, and they make up the big marshes that you know, such as those in York, Wells, Ogunquit, Scarborough, part of the Kennebec estuary. And then as you go from south to north along the coastline, these marshes are really in a diversity of settings, from the more broad embayments and bays in the southern part of the state. And then as you move down east and north, they turn into more fringing marshes and are associated with smaller tidal rivers. And as all of that changes, there's also big shifts in tidal range, sediment supply, inland landform. All of these have played a role in marsh formation in the past and likely will continue to play a role in how marshes respond to sea level rise in the future. So I love this graphic because it, more than anything, it emphasizes the exchange between marine and intertidal and terrestrial habitats. Here they're defined as cross-shore ecosystem services, but you probably are more familiar with the terms such as ecological services or nature-based solutions to what would otherwise become problems for ecological processes or human health and safety. This is really thanks to peat, Pete the marsh. These marshes are made up of meters of peat, and it's and vegetated by plants that together with their dense rhizomes and this combination protects adjacent uplands from floodwaters and waves, and thus shielding properties from the brunt of coastal storms. The roots and stems of plants also help slow water flow from inland sources. So you can see where those arrows are pointing back out to the shoreline there. And so that means that waterborne sediments and even heavy metals or toxins are prevented from entering tidal waters. And those, of course, could clog the water column and harm filter feeders. Salt marshes are also a nitrogen-limited system, which means that the grasses on the marsh will absorb some of the excess nutrients, such as nitrogen, from runoff and help reduce the risk of eutrophication in coastal waters and estuaries. So that's where you hear that marshes are like nature's filter or nature's sponge. So there's funny little red lines. I don't know if anybody else can see those, but they just appeared on my screen. It looks like I've been drawing lines on there. Hopefully they're not distracting. Salt marshes are among the most biologically productive ecosystems in the world. And that is not just because of what's found on the marsh itself, the critters on the marsh, but it's also thanks to decay. Plant material is broken down by microbes and worms, and then that produces food particles that become part of the food web and are taken in by crabs and shellfish and fish in adjacent habitats and on the marsh itself when it floods. The marsh community, the plant community, provides critical feeding, resting, hiding, and nesting or nursery ground for commercially valuable fish and shellfish, as well as birds, including several rare species like this little salt marsh sparrow nestling in the bottom left here. This is a species that is in at serious risk of extinction because of sea level rise, because it nests up in the high marsh portion, high marsh area, and its nesting is timed very carefully with high tides. So as the water gets higher and is unpredictably higher, it can flood out nests before those little guys have a chance to fledge. These tidal marshes, they also support about 20 species identified by the State Wildlife Action Plan as species of greatest conservation need. And then marshes, of course, have these wonderful recreational and aesthetic and educational values that I know we've all enjoyed. And lastly, but not least, tidal marshes do a tremendous job at storing carbon. All those roots and stems and leaves, they die, they break down. And then because of the saturated environment within the marsh, all of that builds up and stays trapped as part of the peat, which serves as the base of the marsh. And that, of course, traps the carbon. In fact, coastal marshes occupy only a fraction of the landscape, but they definitely punch above their weight when it comes to trapping carbon. The terms blue carbon and coastal carbon you may hear, and that refers to the vegetated part of the ocean. So it includes eelgrass, it includes macroalgae like kelp beds, it includes tidal marshes, and in other parts of the world, it includes mangroves. And together, these coastal carbon systems are extremely efficient at capturing carbon, even better than trees. And they sequester roughly 15 times more carbon per unit area than forests do. You don't hear about them maybe as much because they do only occupy that sliver of the landscape. But like I said, they punch above their weight. And you can see in this little graphic on the bottom, those carbon monsters are diving into the depiction of the salt marsh in a sink, suggesting that salt marshes are sinks for carbon. I like that little cartoon. So even with all these tremendous services and values, salt marshes are also extremely vulnerable. Sea level rise is, of course, part of that threat, but other stressors include the fact that they're just limited in their range naturally. And there's impacts from land use, including pollution, development of buffers to the marshes, fill, historic impacts on the marsh itself from ditching, and also invasive species. And one of the big ones is tidal barriers. Features such as tide gates, dams, poorly sized culverts, these kinds of tidal restrictions cause a whole host of problems. One of which, of course, is that it increases the risk of flooding and onto the roadway, causing risks to humans and communities, but also damaging the infrastructure itself. And these restrictions also limit the exchange and delivery of sediment and other materials that the marshes need up and downstream. That whole flow is broken down. So it reduces the resilience of the marsh to sea level rise going into the future. In some cases, the marshes upstream have actually subsided because of that barrier. And in other cases, they have transformed altogether into something that's not even a tidally influenced community and doesn't so much store carbon as emit methane. So they become these greenhouse gas net producers rather than the sinks that they should be. So when you add sea level rise into the mix, some of these processes become, or some of these threats become actually even more complex. And I'll get back to that again in a minute. So checking back in on our progress here, I'm going to move now into talking about the sea level rise scenarios and a little bit about marsh response. One of the fascinating things I think about marshes is that they're governed by these forces that are basically invisible to us, that the gravitational push and pull of the tides, and then of course salt, but also perhaps even more importantly, these tiny particles of sediment, so fine salt and silt that are floating around in the water column. These particles are brought in by the tides, trapped by vegetation, by all those stems and roots, and then they settle and slowly build up on the surface. After the last glaciation, when glaciers retreated and melted and sea level rose globally, our marshes and other coastal landforms grew over a period of about 5,000 years to what we know them as today. And I think it's important to note they did so through this expansion and accretion or building laterally that you can see in this diagram here. But they did so when sea level was rising at a rate of about 1 millimeter per year. So we're talking about sediment. It's tiny stuff, right? It's 1 millimeter per year of growth laterally, but it was enough to keep up with sea level as it rose. Fast forward, of course, now over the past century, as a result of climate change, the rate of sea level rise has roughly doubled and has been recorded in Maine at an average rate of about 2 millimeters per year. That blue trend line that you see there in this graph was produced by the Maine Geological Survey, shows that trend. And the result is about 7 inches sea level rise in the winter. Unfortunately, over the past 25 years, that rate has actually continued to increase, making another jump shown in red. And that recorded rate is about 3 millimeters of sea level rise per year. So putting it at pace for more like a foot of increased sea level over the last century. So the pace of sea level rise is increasing, and that pace will continue to increase under most prediction scenarios. Additionally, local tide gauge data from Maine shows record-breaking sea level on a monthly and yearly basis, particularly in the last 10 years. And the Maine Geological Survey has analyzed all these numbers and reports that 89% of predicted tide levels for 2019 alone were exceeded. So this all means that there's more water up higher on the marsh and for longer periods of time. And to put it simply, the tidal marshes and other coastal habitats are now in this unprecedented change due to rapidly rising seas, and that threat is predicted to increase. This is also on pace with global trends. So how are marshes responding? Maybe you've seen some of these scenes yourself, and it could take hours to go through really how they're responding, but the short version is that we are seeing more water on the marsh, and there are some feedback loops that are triggered, for example, where there's historic ditching that has impacted the hydrology of the marsh. We're now seeing the result is in expanding pools of water, which means vegetation loss. There's also erosion occurring along side creeks and shorelines. and denuded areas where water logging has inhibited plant growth and even increased peat decay and sinking of the surface of the marsh. We're also seeing browning of vegetation along the shoreline and what's referred to as ghost forests. There's an image there on the top left. That's actually from Scarborough, but I know there's some further south too. And it looks like it's a picture taken in fall. The leaves have fallen off, but it was not. Those trees have all died as a result of salt moving further inland and overriding any freshwater inputs. So we see the impact of sea level rise, but harder to detect is how each marsh will respond. Will they continue to build an elevation and keep pace with that rate of sea level rise, or will the marshes start to migrate inland as sediment and water and vegetation move into higher land? This concept of marsh migration is illustrated here, and there's general consensus that although some marshes in Maine and New England may be able to keep up and keep moving up higher, keep their heads above water, so to speak, the marsh movement into adjacent uplands and wetlands will be critical to the persistence of this community and habitat going into the future. It's not all marshes are going to respond the same way. So the takeaway here is that marshes will need space to move inland in order to support their resilience, and protective buffers around those marshes that support their functioning and their connectivity now and in the future across the landscape will also be very important. To that end, the Maine Natural Areas Program worked with partners to develop a marsh migration simulation based on the sea level rise data to help plan for conservation in these critical areas. And there we go. I like to use these images to illustrate what this model looks like. It's basically called a bathtub simulation. So it's like filling the bathtub and the water can go higher and higher wherever the elevation will accommodate it. And I'll give you fair warning, these slides were so perfect like 5 years ago before a new sea level rise scenario set came from the Maine Geological Survey, and I have still not updated my slides. So it still works. You're going to get the point. But the new Maine Geological Survey sea level rise scenarios actually go up to 10.9 feet. My graphics will only go up to 6 today. So perhaps you'll be spared some of the bad news, but that's just the being honest with you here on these slides. So what we start with here, this is a LiDAR image, and if you're not familiar with these LiDAR images, they're pretty cool. They're really high resolution. They pick up everything on the landscape. You can see in the bottom right actual waves moving into the sand and beach and dune, and then sort of around the slicing across the middle is a road, and then you can see the actual river channel itself. So the mapping that we have, this shows the base. So this is the highest annual tide, and where sea level currently extends to inland. We have we consider this highest annual tide to be basically a surrogate for where the marsh extent is. So where the blue line ends, that represents water at high tide, but at the highest tide, but it also represents the extent of marsh on the landscape. So then we can start to flip through and see what a 1 foot sea level rise looks like, 2 foot, 3.3 feet or 1 meter, and 6 foot, what that looks like as it moves across the landscape. So using this sea level rise modeling, we've taken this information and developed our own, so this is just the sea level rise. Now we've moved on to create our own marsh migration mapping. So it's basically the same information, but all we did was we subtracted all developed land. So this is, we presume that marshes will not move onto parking lots, for example. So it shows where there's some critical migration spaces or migration pathways. As you can see in this area circled in green in the middle, there's a large potential area for expansion of marshes based on the fact that there's a lot of natural land cover. Much of this happens to already be in conservation land, but if it were not, then land trusts or towns might consider an area like this for conservation planning or open space. On the other end of the spectrum, that area in red and below shows little to no opportunity for viable marsh movement, not to mention the fact that it looks like a considerable community resilience issue. But there's not much space for marshes to move around in that developed landscape. So based on these marsh migration simulations, if we were to assume, some quick numbers here for you, we assumed that marshes will all have to migrate in order to persist, and that, again, may not be the case. Our analysis suggests that we stand to lose about 54% of our current tidal marsh extent under a 1 meter sea level rise scenario. So looking at it another way, there's only enough low elevation, undeveloped land interior to coastal marshes to replace about 46% of the current marsh area. And that's kind of the extreme view because, again, some marshes may keep up, but it's a kind of a side barrier for what we need to think about, what the potential might be. And I pick 3.3 feet or 1 meter for a specific reason. That's kind of considered a moderate prediction for sea level rise. For further context, the Maine Climate Council in the 2020 Maine Climate Action Plan has recommended that the state commit to manage for 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050 and 3.9 feet by 2100. And then going further to prepare for some more extreme scenarios, prepare to manage for 3 feet by 2050 and 8.8 feet by 2100. So all that's to say that this 1 meter or 3 foot sea level rise scenario, focusing on this one, kind of sits well within that planning framework that's already had a lot of gotten a lot of traction. So the number does sound a little grim, so I'm sorry for that, but hopefully the hopeful news is that on average, the majority of land that is within a marsh migration space or pathway statewide is actually undeveloped, something like 90%. So there's still tremendous opportunity for conservation and proactive, thoughtful land use planning in these coastal areas to help secure the future of these marshes and at a minimum, just give them some room to move. So segue to the last part of my talk here about what's being done. One action, and this is in no particular order, but number one here, conservation. Thanks to the York Land Trust and other land trusts across the state, conservation groups are thinking a lot about marsh migration spaces, as well as the buffers around those future marshes. So remember now that that forested area around a marsh, shown here with the white arrows, it provides critical connectivity within and between coastal systems, and also has its own role of reducing and preventing stressors to marshes, those stressors that would decrease its resilience over time. So, protecting the marsh from higher amounts of runoff, from invasive species, pollutants, etc. So conservation projects, when they protect the marsh, they also are working to protect the marsh migration space, and then even the buffers to the current migration space and future migration space. So it ends up being kind of a win-win-win, where the marshes have some security now and in the future. And I just thought it would be interesting to take a look at York specifically. I know many of you are probably from York or spend a lot of time there, so thought it'd be interesting to take a closer look. This is the York River coming right through the middle, and then where that bright blue color, you see the bright blue color, that is mapped tidal marsh. The bright green color is areas of tidal marsh that are currently protected, so they overlap with conservation land. And that lighter green kind of overlay that you can see in places, that's the actual conservation land. So I took a quick look here, and my bar is hiding my thing. I think it's 25% of York's current tidal marsh extent is actually on conservation land. Is that 25 or 35? I think it might be 35 because I know it tracks pretty well with the state. So statewide, about 38% of current tidal marsh extent is on conservation land. And York has a similar number, just in its own small town relative to the rest of the state. If you then look, oops, I gotta get back on my, here we go. Then you look at the marsh migration scenarios. So all of the marsh migration scenarios are shown in purple and pink shades here. It's 26% of York's marsh migration area under a 1 meter sea level rise scenario is on conservation land. So about a quarter of the potential area is protected. And that also tracks with what's being done statewide, where about 28% of the marsh migration area under a 1 meter sea level rise scenario is on conservation land. So it's tracking pretty well with successes across the state. Okay, number 2 action is restoration. There's definitely not enough capacity in the state, or probably even funds, to take care of the number of tidal restoration projects that have been identified. The Maine Coastal Program has launched a tidal restriction atlas online, and I'll give you a link in a minute, that identifies that close to 90% of the roads that cross tidal wetlands restrict the tides in some way. They looked at over 1,000 restrictions, just over 1,000 restrictions. So this is about, it's like 930 different crossings that are actually restricting the tides statewide. And as I mentioned before, these barriers, of course, cause a slew of problems, both to infrastructure, human safety and community resilience, as well as to the function of the marsh itself and its own resilience to sea level rise into the future. There's a lot of tidal restriction removal projects going on. There's 3 of them pictured just right here. And these are all great. They're working with state and federal funds and showing tremendous benefits for fish passage, tidal exchange, and tidal habitats. And of course, to make roadways safer during storm surges and high tides. Here's a look at that tidal restriction atlas. This is a snip showing the greater York area. So the pink now is marsh. You can see that kind of this shape. That's the York River and Smelt Brook area. There's lots of shapes on here, but basically anything that is red has been documented as a tidal restriction, either a dam or a undersized culvert or some other poor crossing. Right now, those are restricting tides. And then anything that is blue is considered a restriction under a scenarios of sea level rise. So the tide might not be there yet, but once the sea level rise expands into those areas, those will also be restrictions. And number 3 here is monitoring. Maine has significantly expanded its network of long-term monitoring sites in marshes, also known as sentinel sites, I mentioned at the beginning. And with the work of the Maine Coastal Program and partners such as us, MNAP, and IF&W, we're doing this site level monitoring that allows us to better evaluate the impacts of sea level rise on coastal habitats in real time, which we hope will help inform planning. And this is an exciting slide because one of those sentinel sites is actually in the York River marshes. So you can see this picture is not from that site. I have to set up the plots next summer, so I can update that in the future. But the York River marshes will be one of those that's contributing to our understanding of the statewide response of marshes to sea level rise, and you'll have some really good close local data for your own marsh. So quick summary here. Maine's 22,000 acres of tidal marsh are unique, diverse, and valuable, and they protect land and infrastructure from flooding and storms. Sea level rise is increasing marsh vulnerability, and marshes must keep up by accreting sediment or migrate inland to persist. Conserving tidal marshes, their buffers, and marsh migration pathways is critical for their future. And restoring tidal marshes by removing restrictions has multiple benefits for tidal habitats, waterfowl, wildlife, and people. And continued monitoring is needed to detect changes, inform strategies, and adapt. And here's a couple of links that I guess this is recorded, so if you can't scribble those down fast enough, you can come back to it. But the first one shows The Nature Conservancy has taken the marsh migration and sea level rise data and put it into a interactive viewer, which is really easy to use. You can also see where there's things like barriers or vulnerable social areas that would be at risk if there was flooding because of sea level or storm surges. The second one is our own MNAP data for marsh migration. And then the third one is that tidal restriction atlas that I showed you a minute ago. Is a wrap.
That is wonderful. I'll make sure to put. There's an echo. I'll make sure to put all the links in the program archive so that they're easier to click on for people. So you can check back at the library's website in the next couple of days, and I'll make sure that is all up and ready to go. Laura made it back in. Good. So I will let her field any questions to pass along to Kristen, and also to talk about the land trust's role in all of this.
Great. Thank you so much, Sophie. And thank you, Kristen, for such a great and exhaustive presentation. Really, you've covered so much. And sorry, I popped out. I lost internet somehow. It just went off mid-program. So I'm now on my phone. So I'm glad I made it back in, but it means that I don't think I'll be able to share my screen because I'm not well versed in that, but that's okay. I think Kristen actually covered a tremendous amount about the marsh protection that has taken place in York. And so, you know, much of that marshland that she showed that's been protected in New York has been protected by the land trust. And if you're interested in, you know, the exact properties that we've protected along the York River that are marshlands, you can go to our website, yorklandtrust.org. And if you go to our conservation map that we have there, you can just see what ends up being a total of, and maybe Kristen mentioned this when I was off, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating something, but we have close to 650 acres of protected marshland along the York River that we've protected over the past 2 decades. So it's really been a long, slow, steady process of protecting land along the marsh for a whole number of reasons, but including so that as the marsh potentially needs to migrate inland with sea level rise, so it has somewhere to go. So that's one way that we're kind of thinking about the effects of climate change and wanting to position the marshes in a way that they'll be really still strong and able to function as that kind of carbon sink that Kristen talked about, in addition to being really important habitat for so many different sensitive species. So yeah, I think all I was going to do on my screen share was to just to show the close to a dozen different properties that we've protected through the years, and just to show that it is kind of a piecemeal effort, and we are still actively working to protect land along the York River. And the other thing I'll mention is that there is, you know, those close to 650 acres along the river itself that are marshland, but then there are thousands of other acres that we protect within the York River watershed that also contribute to the marsh health. And so all of the land that we've protected kind of from the top of Mount A all the way down to the river, which is, you know, the area where the rainwater and everything else flows from to the river. All of the land protection in there helps kind of absorb runoff and absorb anything that might impact the marshes negatively. And so the point there is just that it's all connected. So it's the land that we're protecting both at the water's edge and all the way up to the, you know, on Third Hill, that's really contributing to salt marsh health in the long run. At least that's our hope. So that's really what I have, and we'd love to open up to questions now.
There's one question here in the chat asking about if volunteers are being used to help with the monitoring
Of the salt marshes?
Yes.
Or are you talking about, is this a question for Kristen or for me?
I don't know. It didn't say, but I guess both of you then.
Kristen, you want to jump in?
Sure. We have not used any volunteers to help with the salt marsh monitoring. But I was just thinking, because it's basically a team of two of us, and having the familiarity with the plants, and there's other measurements that have to take place that are pretty take a lot of training. But I was just thinking, I think there is, and I wonder, Laura, if you're aware of this, there's a kind of a citizen science effort to do photography during king tides, to show where water levels are coming in. So having these photo stations, are you aware of anything like that? Or I'd love to know if you're doing something too in York.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I've heard of that happening elsewhere, but I don't know of that happening in York, but that's a really good question.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have more on that one, but.
Yeah, and then in terms of monitoring on our end, we are always open to volunteers to help with our stewardship efforts, which do look to monitor kind of the easements that we have along the marsh to make sure that they're being respected and treated in the way that they're meant to be within the terms of our easements and things like that. And so if you're interested in volunteering through the Land Trust, definitely welcome you to do that. You can find more information about that on our website in the volunteer section.
Are you doing any planting of grasses, Laura? I guess that's for you. I don't know if it's maybe both of you as well. Are they planting grasses?
Yeah, Kristen, do you know if that's part of the longer term plan?
No, we're not doing any revegetation. There are some various in-marsh restoration projects that are not actually about tidal restrictions. They're about trying to restore the marsh platform itself. But those are more about managing the hydrology, hoping that the marsh can kind of heal itself by reducing the impacts of basically being too soggy. And so those aren't accompanied by any kinds of plantings. The only other thing I'm aware of is that sort of falls in that category is looking at this would be sort of natural infrastructure and something called living shorelines, where there's instead of hardening shorelines like with seawalls or riprap, there are efforts to develop and implement these living shorelines, which are basically made up of organic materials and sometimes plugs of vegetation. So that would be grasses that will help trap sediment and build up on that shoreline rather than continuing to erode away.
Does that seem to be like a more effective way to promote vegetation than planting itself?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically stabilizing the substrate, and then instead of when the shoreline is hardened in some way, it not only eliminates any chance for that piece of shoreline to respond in a natural way to tidal flow or to erosion or to wave action, but it also eliminates the sediment supply. And so it's basically, the issue is it's losing ground, and then hardening that shoreline eliminates any sediment from being mixed back into the system. So it's like taking away more sediment that could be helping to stabilize shorelines into the future. So it's by doing the living shorelines, they use natural materials like logs or oyster baskets, things like that trap sediment, and then further enhance that with some plantings. And that's basically to help prevent that shoreline erosion from continuing to happen, and from allowing natural sediment exchange to occur throughout the system right there locally.
Mm-hmm. Great. Any other questions from the audience?
Please unmute if you'd like, or you can put them in the chat and I can relay them.
You're also always welcome, to visit the Land Trust office if you are interested in chatting more. We're open during normal office hours from 9 to 5 at our headquarters, and we'd be happy to show you maps or just chat more about these things if you're interested in stopping by.
Looks like the Donnellys might have a question, so feel free to unmute if you'd like. Let me send a clicker. You guys can unmute. You're welcome to ask.
Yeah. I wondered whether things such as the oyster baskets of spent oyster shells would help in things such as an effort that didn't work on the York River a number of years ago with UNH. I don't know if Maine has got any of this, Kristen, at all, but they tried to replant several years eelgrass and other grass near the Wiggly Bridge, as it's called in York. And that was never successful. And I wonder if they're, rather than having given up, if there's an opportunity, if we get any kind of, future aquaculture or people save their oyster shells, for having this kind of creative approach for what we need in the York River that we are losing a little bit of now. And I didn't know if you knew much about this activity.
Yeah, I'm sorry I don't know more about it. I do know that the eelgrass planting projects are a very fine-tuned machine in terms of having the right substrate and conditions and flow and all of that. So I'm not sure what the situation was at that UNH site, but it's actually coming up a lot in Maine. There's a need to mitigate for eelgrass loss because of a series of dredging projects. So there's a lot of discussion right now with people that are way more knowledgeable than I am. But just to give you a sense of the conversation that's going on, there's a lot of discussion going on about how to compensate for those eelgrass losses, and would planting projects be the way to go, because they're, I guess, risky. They don't always work out. So you can't guarantee that you're getting what you pay for, so to speak.
You asked about oyster. Did you ask about oyster beds?
I was asking, yes, if we had in the future any oyster releases for any bit of oyster culture growth in the York River someplace, or if people, as some restaurants do, save their oyster shells, do the kinds of activities that are happening in the Great Bays of the Piscataqua. If there was
any knowledge anywhere throughout Maine, or any of the people at UN at Maine were studying using those as the basis of being able to recreate what an eelgrass or any of the other grasses we're losing, banks could would hold for them, and allow those grasses to grow up the river where this endangered salt marsh sparrow is and everything else. I just wondered. Just nobody knows anything.
Well, I guess we'll have to find some place to bring that question. I mean, it seems like a good thought. They have all these places you get your oysters from, these oyster bars, and they're coming from cold water and warm water and every other kind. So seems like it could be a project for one of our many committees.
It's a good question. Yeah, I'm not sure who it would be to bring that question to.
I think what we at the library are realizing through this climate series is that there are a lot of questions that are not yet answered, and a lot of topics that have a lot of action sort of oriented conversations that can still be had. So I fully anticipate continuing this series in some way, shape, or form in the future, and I welcome any suggestions on topics sent my way at the library so that I can, and if you know of people who are experts in different realms of this conversation, I'm happy to connect with them and bring them to a wider audience, because there's a lot of themes that keep reappearing. I know in the conversation we had with Mike Sinclair a couple of weeks ago, some similar concerns and topics are all related. So there's a whole lot of opportunity and there's a whole lot of commitment in York to working in this realm, and I really want to make sure that we all continue thinking about it as actively as we are.
One thing I'll say about the eelgrass work is there's two people I could recommend that would be really knowledgeable about eelgrass, either transplanting or restoration, other types of restoration projects. So I can, one is Jane Disney at Mount Desert Island Biological Laboratory. And then the other is Angie Brewer. She is a marine biologist with the Department of Environmental Protection and is heading up all the eelgrass mapping work for the state. So those would be two people if in particular in York for your climate action planning efforts you wanted to get more information. Another thing I could mention is that this past year, the Maine Natural Resources Conservation Program, which is a wetland mitigation program in the state, funded two projects to do kind of a pilot project at protecting eelgrass by doing what they call conservation moorings. So these are boat moorings that they're helical. So instead of allowing the chain to drag around on the bottom, which scours out eelgrass, there's a helical apparatus of some kind. I don't actually know what it looks like that keeps that chain off the bottom. So they're considered to be conservation moorings because they don't disturb any of the eelgrass on the substrate. So there's things that are being done out there. Some of them pretty innovative. Some of them just needed interest and funding, and so there's some resources that you could look into.
And are there, I guess that's if people want to do it or they know about it, but it's not required to have that kind of mooring. Is that the story?
As far as I know, yeah. I mean, it's Brunswick and Harpswell that are going to be participating in this, and they it's a pilot project to see how it works, and is it something that would persist long term, or do these things even need to be replaced after 10 years, and so more money gets invested. So they're kind of hoping to learn from it, and then they're thinking that long term it would be nice if towns could take on some sort of an ordinance that would be requiring that kind of equipment to avoid any impacts where there's eelgrass within places where there's a lot of boats being moored. So they're hoping for something beyond just the impacts or the benefits that would be within this one boatyard, basically, or one cove. I don't know that it's required by any town.
Thank you. I want to take a minute of everybody's time while you're all here. I live in York Heights. I'm part of an organization called York Connects, which has to do with planning for connectivity in York that is safe for people and the environment. And on April 5th, we're not in the climate list, but we're in the library April 5th for a presentation about connectivity in York and the ballot measure related to it we're calling Pause and Plan Connectivity. Thank you for letting me get this in.
I did have one other question in the chat about from somebody about the most impactful things that you could recommend for individuals to do to protect salt marshes. If you wanted to speak to that.
Sure. Laura, definitely chime in too if you've got some. I think if you are a homeowner that lives within the watershed of any of these estuaries, think about how you're managing your own property, even if it's just your backyard and you're using fertilizers or anything like that. Just be aware that, of course, everything is downstream. I think it's been said a couple of times now, just how everything's so interconnected. And we talk about salt marshes or even wetlands in general as being these tremendous sponges, and they filter things and they absorb and they protect. But there is a point at which they become saturated. They cannot absorb more nutrients or more nitrogen or more heavy metals or toxins or sediment. And the more that these watersheds get developed, the more pressure that is on these downstream wetland systems. So any landowner, just being aware of what you're using in your lawn, what you're using to, on your property. And if you live close to the water, on a tidal creek or on an open marsh, just thinking about what kind of buffer you've got along that wetland or that stream. Is it well vegetated? Does it have natural cover on the ground that will help slow down water runoff and help trap some of that stuff before it actually enters the marsh or enters the creek? And there may be things that you can observe on your own property too, where you say, wow, this year I'm seeing that the water's coming up a little higher, or that suddenly there's a little silt line on this creek that wasn't here 10 years ago when we moved in, or whatever. You can observe those changes too, and maybe adapt your own land use and yard management accordingly. And also, I think just if there are, every town has its own transportation bonds or road, repair projects or things that people get a chance to vote on or speak to in public forums, and where there's a chance for some kind of dialogue about doing road repairs or culvert improvements or barrier removals. If you have a chance to speak up as a citizen who cares about the health of the marsh and say, hey, let's make sure it's done right and it's done to consider with considerations for a 3 to 4 foot sea level rise, adding your voice to that conversation hopefully will help help convince people that it's the right thing to do. So those are all the individual things that I can think to take on and supporting your local land trust.
Thanks, Kristen. Yeah, that's a great list. And one other thing I'll mention, because I also just find it interesting, and I'm sorry if Kristen mentioned this when I was off, but and Kristen did just kind of speak to this a little bit, for all the power that the salt marshes have to offer all these services, including to store carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. If they have that power when they're healthy, and when they're not healthy, they can actually do the reverse, right? So in an unhealthy salt marsh, that carbon that they've trapped for maybe hundreds of years can be released. And so if your yard is full of fertilizers or other things that might eventually get into the salt marsh, that can kind of shift the dynamic of the microbes and things that are storing that carbon and actually release it. And so it's not just that they aren't functioning, they're functioning in a reverse effect. So that's just one more reason to think about what you're doing on your own property and how it might affect the waterways around it.
Definitely.
But yeah, thank you all for these great questions. Yeah, super engaging. And thank you, Kristen, again, for a really engaging presentation. And thank you, Sophie, for coordinating all this and pulling this together.
Yeah, I'm so glad we could host this program and that so many people were able to attend, and hopefully you'll be able to join us for some of our other programs in the next coming months and weeks. And you'll find the recording at yorkpubliclibrary.org/climate tomorrow if I am on top of it, and Friday otherwise. Thank you all so much. Thank you very much, Kristen and Laura, for making this happen.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
Night.
Thank you, everybody.